Welcome to the Times of Israel's daily briefing. Today is Sunday, June 22nd, day 625 of the war. I'm Amanda Borschel-Dan here with our diplomatic reporter Lazar Berman and U.S. Bureau Chief Jacob Magid here for this historic day. Thank you so much for joining me, fellows.
Good morning.
Good morning, Amanda. Hello, Lazar.
Hello.
U.S. President Donald Trump announced early Sunday that the U.S. had carried out a successful attack on the Fordo, Natanz and Isfahan nuclear sites in Iran. Jacob was up all of Israel's night reporting on this, and he'll give us a bit of the blow-by-blow, as well as some reactions from critical Democrats and stalwart supporters of Trump. Lazar is here, and we are going to discuss what comes next. How could this shift the region and, of course, the war with Iran? All of this and more when we're back.
The law basically assumes that the enemy force you are fighting may not care about your civilians, but it certainly cares about its own civilians. What do we do in a reality where you're dealing with an enemy that the suffering of their civilian population is inherent to their war strategy? Now, that doesn't absolve us of our obligations. Hamas's inhumanity does not absolve us of the obligation to humanity. But the context that it creates, I think, is critical to the conversation, and it's very lacking.
I agree, but when democracies fight back against terror groups, they have to fight on two fronts. They have to both fight on the terms that have been laid out by the terror group, and the second thing you have to fight back is by preserving the norms of a democracy. We're forced to ask these moral questions about what we are and what we do, but based on an enemy that is not playing by the rules. But that's what we decide to be a part of by being the family of nations. And as Jews, we say, like every morning in our prayers, we say, Anachnu Amcha b'nei britecha. We choose to be the people of God's covenant, meaning we tie ourselves to an aspiration of justice and righteousness.
I'm Amanda Borschel-Dan here with our U.S. Bureau Chief Jacob Magid and diplomatic reporter Lazar Berman. Jacob, you were up all night, and I actually woke up at 6 a.m. and sent you a holy moly response when I saw what had been going on while I was sleeping. So give us a bit of what happened, a bit of the blow-by-blow. How did this operation roll out before we talk about the responses?
So I think it was at around 3:45 Israel time that President Trump posted on Truth Social that this attack had already actually been finished. Israelis were all sleeping. Nobody really knew. I guess in your case, didn't know until you woke up several hours later. But that the U.S. had managed to carry out strikes on 3 of Iran's major nuclear facilities: Fordo, that underground site that's built in the side of a mountain, Natanz and Isfahan. And Trump makes a point of saying regarding Fordo that high payload bombs were used to take out this site because it's so far underground. My understanding, I think I saw Trump spoke with Sean Hannity from Fox News, who then reported that actually 6 bunker buster bombs were used in order to take that Fordo site out alone. Because it was so difficult, there had been speculation that it would require 2, but not 6, as at least what Sean Hannity had reported. So that's pretty interesting. The U.S. really wanted to be sure that it would totally obliterate that one site. And as for the other 2, Fox News said after speaking to Trump shortly after the strikes, because Trump likes to have those round of calls with reporters right after this big success, like he did after the Israeli strike. And he mentioned that Tomahawk missiles fired from submarines were used to take out those 2 Natanz and Isfahan sites. So that's what happened at, I guess, several hours earlier overnight in Iran before dawn. And then after that, Trump held a speech where he talked a little bit more in detail about what happened.
Okay, before we get to the speech, Lazar, I just want you to weigh in a little bit about the addition of the American capabilities to what Israel has already been doing. And of course, we've heard several times before that Israel has struck these particular sites. But is this the coup de grace? Like, this is the end of these sites forever and ever? Is this the situation here?
No, we should not be expecting an end by force to anything, including Iran's nuclear program. You can damage things, you can destroy things. Of course, they can be rebuilt. And of course, there's other sites. And even though we've taken out much of the top flight scientists, there are still more scientists, and there's ways to reconstitute the program. So anyone thinking that this is going to guarantee that Iran's nuclear program is permanently off the agenda is mistaken. This is a serious blow strategically and to the program itself. Now, most of what has been hit are places that Israel has been hitting or could hit by itself. Of course, the big addition here is the 30,000-pound MOPE bunker busters, something that Israel doesn't have the capability to deliver. Israeli officials have said that they have other options here, but of course, we probably won't get to see what those options were if they indeed existed. Now, besides the actual physical damage, the big development here is that now Iran has to make a choice. Do you capitulate here and go back to some sort of negotiation and accept Trump's terms on much worse conditions than what you could have negotiated maybe 2 weeks ago? And then you're going to look very weak, and the legitimacy of the regime will be undermined, and maybe even its long-term survival will be in significant danger. Or do you decide you're going to have to flex your muscles and actually hit American or allied assets in the region and risk, Trump returning with much more force? So there's really no good options for the Iranian regime right now, and it shows how badly they've miscalculated, how badly they've misplayed their hand over the last couple months. And now they find themselves under attack from a very, very capable and effective Israeli military. And now you have the most powerful military in the world, the U.S., with its seemingly unending logistical and operational capabilities, which has just joined the fight and seems willing to do so again if needed.
Okay, so Jacob, let's hear what Trump had to say about the state's willingness to go back to the negotiating table and its willingness to not. So let's hear what Trump had to say.
Sure. So Trump in the speech began by kind of reviewing what the U.S. had hit, and saying specifically that it actually totally obliterated. So actually goes further than I would agree what Lazar is saying, is we don't really know the full extent of the damage yet. I think those trying to predict the exact amount of time that the nuclear program has been pushed back probably are a little bit guessing at this point. Obviously, there are some indications, but it's hard to know so early. But Trump said totally obliterated. The goal was the destruction of Iran's nuclear capabilities and the nuclear threat, and those two goals have been met, is what Trump says at the beginning of the speech. He's flanked by, I believe, U.S. Vice President J.D. Vance, Secretary of State and National Security Advisor Marco Rubio, and Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth. So the men are all behind him. And he then goes on to say that Iran is the Mideast bully, and it now must make peace. And what was interesting, I thought, also, is that this is not a very long speech, but he made a point to thank Prime Minister Netanyahu very early on and say that they worked as a team in this operation. Israel made a point of also saying it was closely coordinated with the U.S. on this, but I think definitely hearing his own name on the international stage like it was in this speech probably was music to Netanyahu's ears, to something that he can highlight in the future when he's talking about his diplomatic chops and being able to influence the U.S. president the way he has. And Trump ends his speech basically saying, look, Iran, you can choose between peace or tragedy, because we know we have other targets. We have a target bank that we didn't finish striking in this overnight attack, and then if you decide to take out or target U.S. personnel in the region, there's lots of options that Iran has on the table right now. The bases that Iran has in Qatar and soldiers it has in the UAE and Saudi Arabia and elsewhere, it could take those options to I think, as a lot of these countries are fearing, to target those troops or even energy or oil sites in the region. But Trump is saying, think twice, because we can continue hitting you. I think my assumption is that Iran is probably hoping that those in the Republican Party that have been questioning Trump against this move, saying that this is dragging us into a war that we don't really know necessarily how this is going to end. The hope is that for them, that this is just a one and done strike, and therefore Trump will actually be less inclined to respond, even if he's talking about responding right now. That's something that he won't actually want to do. So I think there's a lot of discussions that will likely be had in the Situation Room and with Trump's allies in the coming days to get an understanding of where we go from here.
Right. Lazar, Trump obviously in all caps put on his Truth Social network, now is the time for peace. But as you said, Iran has some choices to make. We here in Israel already experienced a large barrage of ballistic missiles following this strike, and at least 11 were wounded. Obviously, look at our live blog for more updates throughout the day, and I'm sure there will be plenty. But Lazar, do you feel that the U.S. is actually in a position that it could activate its tens of thousands, I believe, soldiers in the region and create some kind of boots on the ground scenario?
No, I don't think that's likely. And most of the troops that are in the region are there to do the strategic projection that is the very reason that the U.S. has all these bases. That's Air Force, that's the Navy, and things like that, or the mission to continue to fight ISIS in Syria and northern Iraq. There's not pre-positioned troops that are about to invade Iran. I think that is, vanishingly unlikely. What is more likely is I still don't think this is likely, but you could imagine a scenario in which special forces teams are dropped at a certain site to destroy it from the ground. That is something that was also possible from the Israeli side as well when they spoke about different options for Fordo. If you remember the attack on the Masyaf site in Syria, where you had, I believe it was the Shaldag Air Force commandos who dropped on the site and destroyed it from the ground. So that was something that was within the realm of possibility. But if we're thinking about some sort of ground attack, first of all, it doesn't match the way Trump wants to approach conflicts in the Middle East. And second of all, it's just not, the troops just aren't there. So I don't think that is what we can expect. But of course, bombing from the air, depending on how Iran reacts, is certainly a continued possibility.
Let's go to a short break.
What surprised you the most discovering about Jewish life in the United States?
I think it's the pride. I think I was envy of that pride. Just being proud, being a proud Jew. It's something that I never even contemplated. I was just an Israeli. I think the fact that, in Israel, we have all sort of sectors in society. You kind of grow up with your kind. I hate that. The fact that I don't know a lot about my Jewish life, and I need to go abroad just to understand that. It's something so messed up, and how we grew up here. It's just, I think, once it got political to be Jewish in Israel, it made me kind of push away from that. Once I got to LA, once I got just being with my daughters abroad, just understanding what we are, my heritage, where we come from, our story, our values. It took me a long time. It took me a long time to get there.
And we're back. I'm Amanda Borschel-Dan here with our diplomatic reporter, Lazar Berman, and U.S. Bureau Chief Jacob Magid. I would like to discuss a bit of the blowback that has happened in the U.S. so far since this attack on Iran. And we're seeing, it's no surprise to me, but that we're seeing critical voices out of the Democrats, including leading Democrats such as Chuck Schumer, Hakeem Jeffries, but we're also seeing blowback from the stalwart MAGA supporters of Trump. So, Jacob, let's talk first of all what we're hearing from the Democrats.
Democrats are in unison against this strike, it seems like right now, maybe besides for Fetterman, the Democratic senator, kind of the lone senator, I would say, that's always been pretty actively supportive of Israel. But the rest are against this strike, and I think they give two reasons. The one is that they feel that the U.S. should simply focus on policy, that the U.S. should not be going into this war, that it's a costly decision that will drag, that we don't know how it will end. And we've seen intervention in the Middle East go sideways before, and this is just an extension of that. But I think the more notable track that the most prominent Democrats, like you mentioned, Hakeem Jeffries and Chuck Schumer, are taking is to criticize not policy, but procedure, and talk about how Trump really needed to get approval, authorization from Congress in order to make this decision. And they argue that it was unconstitutional, that he did not do so. Now, this is an argument that I think is a little bit, it's easier to make, but I don't think it really stands a lot of ground just because it's not something that typically is done in the past. Very rarely do presidents actually seek congressional approval for taking these kinds of steps that do have massive ramifications, and Congress has every right to demand that they are involved in the process, but it's just not really done. So I don't know really how much the argument actually moves the conversation forward. But it's notable that the Chuck Schumer is not making an argument of this is the wrong decision to make necessarily, but rather saying, look, we should have been consulted first, and then maybe we would have approved it. But that's.
Okay, fair enough. And as you noted, Trump was flanked by his boy crew when delivering his announcement of this attack. But what was notable, and many have pointed out on X and other social media, that one of the men was wearing a different colored tie, and that is J.D. Vance. And many are hypothesizing that this is because he actually dissents from this decision. So would he be in this crew of MAGA stalwarts who are actually critical of this operation?
Yeah, I don't think so. I think he already set the groundwork for falling in line with Trump several days ago when I think he was dispatched to calm some of the concerns amongst these more MAGA isolationists by tweeting about how, yes, Trump recognizes the costs of sending troops or just making these decisions to involve itself with Iran, but he also has been clear that Iran cannot get a nuclear weapon, and he will be responsible about the decisions he makes. But I trust the president, J.D. Vance said then, and I think just because he was wearing a different colored tie on Saturday night in the U.S. time does not mean he doesn't still trust him now. It was interesting that it just wasn't just Vance, that it was also other MAGA isolationists who fell in line pretty quickly. I noted Charlie Kirk, who wasn't adamant against intervention, but this is a young Republican activist, the founder of Turning Point. But he did say this could really create a schism amongst Trump's base if he does choose to go ahead and carry out the strike. But after the strike took place, then you saw him say, I completely support the president's decision. This was great. You had, I believe, also Matt Gaetz, the former congressman, very hardcore MAGA, who had been very critical of Israel recently. He's got a podcast that's been a large following. And after the strike happened, he actually was very supportive of President Trump and saying this is the right decision to be made. And the last person I'll give an example of is Tim Sheehy, who's a Republican senator from Montana. And the reason I bring him up now is because a couple days ago, he was one of the people I quoted on the podcast talking about how you can make a strike against Iran, but this idea that this is just going to be a one and done concept is just a fantasy. There's going to be blowback that you're going to have to deal with, basically saying, I don't think this is a very smart decision. And now, after the strike's over, completely, Trump is in the right. This is the right decision to make. I support the president's decision to strike Iran. So those are the people falling in line behind the president. There was, I think I saw Republican Representative Massey from Kentucky who did come out against it. He's kind of been a lone wolf, and I expect maybe Rand Paul, another lone wolf from Kentucky, will do the same. But broadly, I think it's not surprising when you have a sitting president, even if you don't necessarily agree with him, you come out. That's the nature of politics, unfortunately, in some ways, that you put your disagreements aside and support the leader of the party.
Lazar, let's talk about some criticism that we're hearing in the region, and it comes as no surprise, of course, that Saudi Arabia has already issued a condemnation of this strike. What did the Saudis say, and what do you expect to hear from others in the region? It's very early here still.
Yeah, so not surprisingly, the Saudis, as they did to the Israeli campaign itself, came out against it, and that's what I expect to hear from the pro-Western Gulf states and the pro-Western Arab states in the region. I will note it's interesting, first of all, that Syria hasn't weighed in on this campaign, which is, I think, notable. But this is the behavior that we've seen from the Gulf states since Trump in his first term didn't respond to the Aramco attacks, that the drone and missile attacks that were blamed on Iran that shut down half of Saudi Arabia's oil capacity. And when Trump didn't do anything to respond to it, Saudi Arabia understood that the way to guarantee its security is to talk to Iran and try to de-escalate, because it doesn't want to get into any sort of conflict with Iran. And those Gulf states have been very, very concerned about the potential that in order to respond to the U.S. and possibly to Israel, they would be hostages, that they would be attacked by Iran to try to get to force America either not to attack or to compel it to stop attacking. And that's still a concern. But I'm positive that deep down they want to see the U.S. and Israel damage this regime as much as possible. That's still the big enemy of the pro-Western Gulf states, and they would like to see, they certainly want to see the nuclear program done away with. They would like to see the regime fall as well, but they don't expect them to say anything like that publicly. This is what we expect, and this is what this is kind of what they have to say. I'm sure the Europeans as well will say it's important to de-escalate. There's always that word. Let's get back to negotiations. And let's make sure this doesn't spread. But, you've kind of heard it between the lines and sometimes more explicitly that Israel's been doing the dirty work, that this is something that the Europeans were very concerned about, and they didn't really have a real program to stop the program. They were kind of moving towards snapback sanctions in a couple of months. But I think everyone, if this does not expand to something broader and there's limited scenarios in which that happens, then they are, behind the scenes very happy, and that they didn't have to do it themselves, and that the U.S. and Israel are doing the work for them, and they are the ones who Israel's facing the blowback and potentially the U.S., but the Europeans can sit there and see the world be made better and more safer in their eyes.
Okay, I want to end with a bit of a speculative question that I'm sure we're going to discuss in the coming days as well, but people have always discussed the ideas of the axes, right? There's the axis of the U.S. with Israel and other nations, and then there's the axis of Russia with China and Iran. And Lazar, just to end with, very briefly, again, we will dive into this more, I'm sure, coming up. How do you see this particular strike shifting these axes?
So in general, the Iranian axis, Israel has done a very good job in weakening it, taking it apart in some cases. You don't have a ton left. Obviously, the Assad regime in Syria is gone, and that was a key link. Hezbollah not responding at all when Israel is striking Iran. That was one of the main reasons that Iran supported it all these years. Of course, Hamas is in a totally different situation now, is fighting for its life. And the Houthis are the kind of the last one in the game, but they're not, they can bother a lot of people, but they're not really a decisive force at all. So the Iranian axis definitely weakened, and we'll see if they're able to reconstitute it moving forward. I think people are going to be their shine has lessened, that they're going to be a much less attractive partner now that we see that they cannot defend their allies, and that they're certainly not the most powerful actor in the region. So that's one. If the U.S. is smart, and if Netanyahu is willing to play along, you could really see the pro-Western states really make a nice alliance in the region that Israel's a part of. But of course, Israeli decisions will be part of that. And I think we see that Russia and China, they've been trying to use a number of ways, economic and sometimes military means, to push the U.S. out of the region, or at least reduce their influence. And we're going to see that they are not having any influence on what is happening in the region. And I think other countries will understand that as well. And that it's, even though you have this president that has talked about, getting out of the Middle East in many ways, the U.S. is still the dominant force, both militarily and economically in the region. And the region realizes that.
Jacob, I have a final question for you as well. Do you feel that the American people are supportive of this attack in general?
I think for now, you won't see major pushback. I think polls indicated that this wasn't something that Americans necessarily wanted to see overall. But again, it will really depend on how this plays out. If we start seeing U.S. personnel attacked in the region, but more importantly, really for the American public, is how this impacts their wallets. So if we do see strikes on energy or oil sites, or Iran deciding to close the Strait of Hormuz, and that starts impacting really the U.S. economy and economy around the world, then I think you could see some more pushback from both in Trump's base and more broadly as well.
Listeners, again, this is a quickly changing story, so please check out our live blog for more updates. Jacob, Lazar, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you.
Thanks, Amanda.
Thanks for listening to the Times of Israel's Daily Briefing. Please check out another episode tomorrow. This installment was produced by the Podwaves and video edited by Thomas Gersh. If you have any questions or comments about this or any other episode, please drop us an email to podcast@timesofisrael.com. Until tomorrow, shalom.